To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the Bejugal people who are the traditional custodians of this land which we are broadcasting from. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders both past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here and are also watching us later on. Thank you. To kick us off, would you like to introduce yourself, Connor?
Yeah, hi, and thank you to those who are joining us for this session, Fanfiction Beyond the Canon. My name is Connor Phipps. I'm a creative writing student at UNSW in my third year. And in this session, as well as in life, I'm newer to fanfiction, but I have a growing interest. And that's sort of what inspired part of this talk. I've dipped my toe into different areas based on recommendations from friends, including Lychee. But my journey really started searching for works that I was at least familiar with the universe for, which led me to thinking about Canon sort of divergent pieces. For me, I started, as it is my favorite book series, with fics inspired by Frank Herbert's Dune, which has then led me down a path of different sci-fi and fantastical works, playing into familiar things like Lord of the Rings, the Witcher series. But I chose these because I knew I was comfortable with the setting and I would feel more open to seeing characters reimagined, their relationships changed and explored, to see and sort of find something in the work that wasn't necessarily in the original, but is, a perspective opened up by these new writers and the experimentation, which is why I've really grown to love fan fiction. That's a bit about me, so I'll pass it back to Lychee.
Hi, I'm Lychee. I'm also a student at UNSW. I am involved as the coordinator on Sweetend, and I'm also the administrator for Gamma Mari, the student publication here. I've been reading fan fiction ever since I had access to the internet, which may or may not have been a good decision. But hey, we make choices, and sometimes we don't suffer the consequences, because here we are. I've read the gamut of fan fiction. At one point, I exclusively only read chaptered fics that had 10K per chapter, which was a choice. But that was also made during my adolescence. So we live and learn, because sometimes that bloat doesn't count. But yeah, I've read a ton of it, and I would love to talk about it here today.
Well, I think a good place then to begin is broadly just defining fan fiction with an idea of both, what it is, but why do we sort of silo it as being fan fiction and not necessarily calling it something else, some other form of writing?
Absolutely. So the definition of fan fiction, I borrowed from Cecilia Aragon and Katie Davis's definition. Fan fiction is a type of transformative creation in which fans of a variety of different media, including TV shows, movies, comic books, anime, and video games. But this doesn't also include fans of celebrities, which is a whole other can of worms, known as RPF. If you know, you know, that's great. We're not going to dig into that too much in the scope of this talk, where fans of this media produce stories based on the original media while expanding on or altering them. And to return to your other part of the question, which was like, why is it siloed off like this? The reason why it's siloed off is because of legal. Legal is a major reason as to why these stories are only paid for production or only like distributed between fans during the early days before the proliferation of the internet and the breakdown of barriers, systemic or otherwise, in terms of being able to access wholesale these like huge archives. But also even before then, there were smaller archives specifically for each fandom or even each ship, which is a ship is functionally like a romantic pair. Like two people involved in a relationship. There were archives. Usually, I can't give an approximation of how many there were because they're lost to time. But is there anything that I didn't touch on in that question?
No, I think that was really good. And you kind of got ahead of where I'd like to go next. But I think it would also be good to, yeah, I guess talk about that development then, of what, I guess, how fan fiction is accessed or presented today, because we have the internet and it's a huge base. But you've already said that there was, fan fiction pre the proliferation of like massive online archives. So it'd be good to maybe talk a little bit about that, but also focusing on, I guess, that emergence of different platforms. Which ones are the most, popular today? I think a big one is like AO3. I think when you search fan fiction, that comes up, archive of our own, for those who don't know. But how that's come to be there, and then also what role it serves, I think is really interesting. I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, I can speak to that. The development of fanfiction, I can't speak to very broadly because my point of reference is only like late 2000s at the very edges of them, and then like mid 2010s I saw the proliferation and rise of these huge platforms that were an aggregation of these like individual small archives. And the reason why those actually fell out, like became functionally obsolete or like were inaccessible, is just because it costs money and like time to maintain these archives. Because you may be interested in this show or this pairing or like this piece of media, but you might have that incredible drive to keep it, like to moderate everything, to keep on top of like the forum attached to it, and also like keep in contact with people and sort of showcase like, hey, this is a great place for you to put your content, put your stories, put everything on there. Would love to facilitate this community. The reason why they're not around as much is because it takes a lot of effort, and there's a lot you can say about the aggregation and like mass nature of everything on the internet as it relates tangentially to fanfiction. But that's why people have, by and large, like moved towards that like large platform where they can put their stories or put their art, put their everything on there, so they don't have to bear the responsibility of coming up with a tag system, coming up with filtering, coming up with like, I have to like figure out this website, figure out the back end. How do I stop like people from like spamming this website? I have to pay for like upkeep. What are the back end things that I need to worry about? Most people don't necessarily want to put in that much effort. They just want to share their story. That's the main reason. I don't know if I covered everything.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'd just like to circle back because I think you talked about that the way that it's presented. So to me, it seems that it's the way that fan fiction is, delivered online. That kind of is what leads to these like website archives. Like, maybe you could talk a little bit about how fan fiction is most like commonly presented. Like, from my understanding, it's generally very serialized. It seems like obviously there are many authors, but for the way that readers access it is, generally you find several writers that you enjoy, who post from anywhere from like once a blue moon to like semi-regularly, and you kind of return back to the work that they put out. But it doesn't necessarily flow as like one complete cohesive piece of work. It's not like putting out a novel. So how would you define that format then?
I would define it as ongoing serialization, much like comics or manhwa or webtoons or manga. There are a lot of online only. It also extends to print. It's just that print is just extremely expensive with the rising cost of paper and everything else, and not a commensurate rise in readership, paid readership additionally, which makes literary journals or these print magazines, they become functionally obsolete just because of economic pressures. And speaking to how fanfiction is framed in how readers access it, I want to return to a little bit of how you talked about like how it's shown. It's a little bit of I think you identified like it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where like, oh, it's framed like this, but that's how like the with all the like tags and everything, and how it's like, oh, you have these filtering systems of language. Oh, it's rated T, it's rated G, whatever. These were implemented because people wanted a way to sort of filter out like, oh, what is it? And then over time, people came to expect them, and new people who came into it later in like in the fan cycle, they just became accustomed to it. It's like people wanted it, and then people got used to it, and then people expected more like individuation and sort of like, I want to know specifically whether this has a major character death in it, and if so, I want to filter it out, for example.
Right, that's really interesting, and also quite different, I guess, in many ways from traditional publishing. I mean, obviously, we'll have categorization if we think of it from what the consumer sees. You have genres and subgenres. We also get, how would I call this? Well, not just how it's categorized in a bookshop, where it's broadly put into sort of a fiction section, but you also, have individual and independent sellers listing things under, these are like youth or young characters. So it's interesting to see that rise there, but it seems way more like proliferated on fan fiction. Do you think that the fact that it's so, I guess, customizable in your search is how much do you think that plays a part in the sort of popularity, if any?
That customizability, that's why people come to fanfiction, because it's inherently transformative and they want to see a variation of canon. It's also because they have a familiarity with the story. It's easier to know what you're going to get from the outset, because that familiarity means that you can just see your favorite characters played out in a different scenario. Oh, if they were in canon, they just had a miserable, tragic existence. Then in fanfiction, they can just, they can have like a complicated like school life, but they're not going to get killed. Like not every character is going to like be like open to like going to get killed by the author every second episode. Game of Thrones, Attack on Titan, let's not go there. But these stories that are very open-ended to tragedy, people want to explore the possibilities where these characters are happy. That's, I think, a big driving force of why people go to these things. And also because there's a lot of romantic potential as well that can be explored in fanfiction. And that is a driving force behind why, oh, maybe you were following this series and these characters got together, but you actually think that this side character and main character should get together. There's 1,000 of them. There's 20,000. You can take your pick. It's fine. Like, depending on how big the fandom is, you're going to be just fine. I got ill when I looked at like a really big shonen manga the other day, and I saw that it was like 60,000. I was like, oh, okay, 60,000 for this pairing alone. Okay, I'm gonna feel ill. That's cool. Yeah, that sort of thing. It's open-ended. It's customizable. It's also, you can play around with canon. You can make things better. You can make things worse. Time travel fix-its, they're very popular in certain fandoms because people like the idea that, hey, all of this tragedy, all of this misery, all of this death could have been averted if only this one thing was changed. But personally, I want to see how it gets worse. Okay.
I love that. That's so you. I can't deal with that. Like, that's why I initially struggled to get into stuff, because I think fan fiction is beautifully so, very character centered. Most of the pieces that I've seen, I'm sure that there are some that follow more like traditional sort of plot centered works, but it does seem that people return there to really, like you said, like protect the characters or torture some characters that they thought deserved worse than they got in their respective, origin work. But I guess that sort of leads me then to this two points. One being, how then do you have authors who work on a piece that becomes like alternative, that's exploring something else, that then becomes popular? So things that we've seen, like basically the trajectory of something like 50 Shades of Grey being like a relatively well-known and cited example of like fan fiction turned traditional, success. But you may have other case studies, and then outside of the sort of Western publishing, there might be other examples. But that's like, where do you, or how do you sort of think about that role? Because for me, that's a really interesting space, because you're dealing with like existing work, you're taking existing characters, and I guess is it the situation that has changed so much that makes it feels completely fresh? Because if someone is interested in, Twilight, and then they go to read or write a fan fiction about Twilight, how much are they going to change? And because if you change too much, does it become so much that it starts to feel less like fan fiction? Like, is something about fan fiction having to be recognizable to the original work? And is that what then promoted success and then could, potentially lead to that pathway? I'd like to start there and then consider the pathway some more. So like, do you think that that level of relatability to a recognizable piece of work is what initially is, what makes it popular?
Okay, so you're speaking to how a fic can become popular and gain traction and then facilitate self-publishing or other traditional avenues of like literary acumen or whatever. But you want me to focus on what renders it still legible as fanfiction, correct? Okay, awesome. I'm going primarily the characters. It's fine if the world is legibly different. There are of course people who are going to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. If you want canon to be as it is, that's your cup of tea, and I don't want to yuck your yum. Absolutely, have at it. You're probably not going to have some fun in follow-up adaptations of that work. I'm going to be completely serious, because they play fast and loose with canon. But I think the main thing that writers need to keep in mind, or well, they do, which is then how it gains traction, is as to whether it feels like the character. I will say this, it doesn't really matter if the character is true to canon in so much as the character still feels like the canon character, even if it isn't. Does that make sense? It's like, okay, this character still feels like what the fan thinks of as the character. It doesn't have to map one-to-one with how that character is in canon. This is well felt in how some film adaptations of characters, their characterization overrides the book or like the original canon that was there before the film is the adaptation of. That's the main thing, to be honest, whether it still reads legibly like that or it contains some element from canon that is still recognizable. If that is what the conceit of the story is around, then that aspect needs to read true to the reader. Whether it reads true to canon is less important in so much as whether the reader feels like it is still true. Because, well, this is of course also more important and relevant for people who like read more for character, which is of course what I am. But there are also people who are interested in the world, but I don't hear about them as much comparatively, or maybe it's just because of the like fic that I do read. But also I have been reading some, but I also haven't read the canon in like 3 years, so things what it is. And does that answer your question as to how it still reads legibly to fans from the thing? And now you want me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I guess then I'm interested in if you had any thoughts to why we don't see like more works taking that pathway to go from this like the E.L. James 50 Shades of Grey, starting as a Twilight work that then I assume the pathway was like it became quite popular, and basically if you have a readership, it's then having that already base readership, but like taking that next step to change it, because obviously those works read very differently as they are like printed in the traditional sense, and accessing the original is difficult. So trying to compare what the first version looked like and how recognizable it was. But do you think that that is like a replicatable like sort of pathway for like current authors?
I'm going to qualify it in many ways because Twilight it changed the landscape of the publishing industry. It has sold over 160 million copies globally. It spawned and launched the careers of many actors and is why like we know several like celebrities today. While you may criticize like its representations of this and that and the integration of the indigenous people as werewolves is definitely questionable, and I don't think that the editor should have made that choice. It should just no, that was not a good choice. Saying something like that can be replicated is like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Whether you think the quality of it is good or not, that's besides the point. It was something that moved like over like an insane, incomprehensible amount of units of books across the world. It and E.L. James' 50 Shades of Grey, or as it was known in fanfiction as Master of the Universe, it was a serialized fanfiction that picked up on the subtext and often the explicit text of, hey, they're like playing at things in a very interesting representation of heterosexuality, I would say. And what E.L. James did was heighten that and then made it legible in a mortal framework. And that like the most familiar point of reference was BDSM. Whether that's good representation, I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that, but like, you can read about how the community has reacted to it. It started off as a serialization and then it gained traction. And I want to emphasize several factors that led to its popularity, which was one, the fact that it was so prolific. It updated fairly regularly. And so it was boosted up to the most recent works, which is how like people see it at first glance. And then the fact that there's a lot of engagement with it. The author is talking to fans, like there is a community generated around it. Like that cannot be underestimated, because if you think that this work is so great and you're like so keen for the next chapter and the author replies back to you and the author also updates like every week, that's exactly what you want. You're going to tell the author like, oh, I love this, like I love this scene, I love this like aspect of it. Like you're going to be engaged, and that engagement is going to fuel writers. Like that is a huge factor as to why things get to the incomprehensible like word counts that they do. Like that is a reason why there's a 16 million word fic on fanfiction.net. I thought it was, I'm gonna eat humble pie. I told you before that it was 4.5 million. I'm gonna eat my humble pie. I was wrong. I looked it up and I was like, that's 16. Okay, I was wrong. But yeah, that level of engagement like boosted that along with the fact that Twilight was like huge. You're not going to get that with an obscure French indie series that is like very difficult to get a copy of, much less translate to English. That you're not going to see that same level of success. The pervasiveness of like Twilight in culture, and then also the fact that, oh, you can read more of this stuff and it's online and free, and you can also talk to other people about it and you don't need to feel a sense of shame around it, that's going to generate a more, that lays the ground for a more engaged community. And it led to E.L. James then taking the leap. And let me find what in my notes about it specifically. She ended up partnering with the Writers Coffee Shop Publishing House to do print on demand and ebooks of her, like, of largely reskinned Twilight fanfiction, which was then acquired by Vintage Books, an imprint of Penguin Random House in 2012. And we have, similarly to Twilight, a ridiculous and incomprehensible number of like 170 million copies moved worldwide for 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that is, yeah, huge numbers with that, and then also just huge numbers with the work. What did he say?
16 million by James Dean, 5842. It was the Loud House fanfiction. I've never heard of it. Apparently, it has a lot of crossovers. And when I looked at the description, I was like, you know what? I respect it, even if I skimmed the chapter titles and I thought, oh, this is a lot of crossovers. I've read stuff that was just serialized crossover into different IPs that the authors read. It's an interesting experience.
So beyond the E.L. James, the sort of E.L. James trajectory, then, like, are there other successful transitions from fan fiction to traditional publishing?
Of course, and I actually found some Australian examples for us. C.S. Bakar, she's an Australian author. She wrote The Captive Prince. Like in 2013, she tweeted, "For years as a fanfic writer, I couldn't vision or produce original work. And I just thought, I can't do it, so I'm not a writer." Even though she was writing like a ton of original and also like fan fiction stuff on LiveJournal, I believe. And that's where she gained traction. That LiveJournal isn't traditionally an archive purposed website. It was originally started as a blogging website, but then, you know, that's where a lot of people put up their works and everything like that. And there's also Shelley Parker Chan, who they wrote, I believe, the Radiant Emperor series. I know the titles of the works. She Who Became the Sun and He Who Drowned the World. I'm not a fake fan, I swear. They read and wrote fan fiction. Here's a little quote from them. "A lot of fan fiction stories are romances, structurally speaking, but the ones I read and wrote were based on science, SFF media, fantasy and science fiction, like historical fiction." Yeah, that's where they played around with fan fiction. And a lot of the qualities in their work that I really like hyper emotional stories with high stakes, juicy character driven arcs, and cathartic fantasy feel, along with queerness, are all qualities that I appreciate in their work that I normally kind of have to look for in fan fiction. I know that it's a lot better in terms of queer fiction being published today, but I'm going to say it's a lot easier to find queer fiction in fic today than it is even today, with a lot easier in terms of opportunities and ease. It's just a lot easier. Like, I can't honestly think of an asexual, like I can't think of a story with an asexual protag, just off the top of my head, that is like well known, or like not even well known, just published. I can't think of a story with that, and I can't think of a story where the multiplicity of identities aren't parlayed around as if like, oh, the multiplicity of identity is the reason why it is published, rather than it being secondary to the fact that, oh, like this story is like really cool, and also the characters are this way, just because it's like that's just built into the story, instead of, hey, it's a sterile world where like, oh, we're only going to consider one aspect of identity markers and we're not going to engage with intersectionality in a functional state.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and you kind of answered a question I was going to ask later, which was what ways did you think that fan fiction sort of reflects or intersects with what is like popular in the mainstream or is lacking in the mainstream. But yeah, I think you've basically covered that, and it reminds me of like a previous piece I was reading about the sort of role of fan fiction, particularly in both the social and academic way of being like queer writing, queer in the sense of, yes, being directly representative of identities that are not present in like traditional media, but also queer as in writing against what is being presented. And I think what's really interesting then for what you said though, is like in fan fiction, we're seeing in traditional publishing an interesting and very necessary, like, continual emergence of representation with you having more queer representation like across the board. But like you said, what can you name a popular like asexual whether character or story that revolves around it? And also then I would challenge that by going, can you name like a popular queer story that it doesn't have the main characters as like being like the sort of central like queer relationship that then the story is like revolving around? We don't, like, I think in fan fiction you're going to get a lot of queer main characters, of course, but you also just get queer like side characters who just happen to be whether they're like homosexual or pan or bi or even asexual. And I think that's really interesting, because what it means is like fan fiction doesn't necessarily just, it's not it doesn't have an agenda to want to be like heterosexuality or what we've seen in most works needs to be like removed and replaced. It's quite literally just putting that perspective and that work into it, like taking a real like lived experiences, taking real representation, and having that reflected in like literary works. And it'll do that even to works that, if it were an agenda, would have fit into that. Like seeing more, I think of a huge fantasy series that has got a lot of traction, a lot of good praise for sort of queer representation, especially like quite nuanced and diverse queer representation, which is the Priory of the Orange Tree. But even in like looking at works online, I've seen places that have taken those relationships further or changed them slightly in the context, and imagine different scenes that the book doesn't cover to develop those further. And so it's not going to shy away from even, it's not opposing, but it's contrasting and it's broadening, what is becoming more popular, which is great. And I think it's really like speaks to what I think is the primary I guess potential and like power in sort of the broader sort of literary sphere, which is to literally that fill in gaps that even with like good intentions and good representation are going to occur. But I wonder if you think that there is like more space there, or how other ways that fan fiction interacts with that realm, or like what it offers. but maybe talking about it directly in reference to different, cultures or legal systems, like beyond just what we focused on. We focused on a little bit of Australia, obviously America with Yale James and things like that, and popular sort of Western publishing. But I know you have some insight into, beyond that. So what is fan fiction's role in that?
I am going to qualify this by the fact that I have a very narrow window. It's more just like my friends mentioning stuff, and I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. Tell me more. And because my friends are from all over the place, I've been like told that a lot of like fic archives in, like, for example, South Korea, they're like they have like a sort of informal like self-selection process to kind of suss out whether you're an actual fan or not, and that prevents like bad faith actors like sort of entering the community and causing a ruckus. And they're also like less likely, as in just terms of fan behavior, unlikely to bring it to the attention of someone who is like the creator or like related to the piece of media. Whereas I've seen a lot more of that behavior in English speaking like fandoms. I've just seen a lot more of it. Of course, this isn't a blanket thing, and everything I say is like massively qualified. And this sort of behavior is mirrored in China as well, where fic archives are like they're not like the like similar like the self-selection process of filtering out who's like bad faith actors like through. It's also like, hey, like people are kind of moving into those spaces knowing that, hey, we're probably going to have to like move to a different URL or whatever, and like let's like be more diligent about archiving and saving this for our own like back reading, like that sort of thing. But I will say, contrary to these like fan behaviors in these different countries, everything I'm saying, this is a broad stroke interpretation, and if your experience is different, that's completely fair. I'm not disproving any of that. This is just a very narrow window provided to me by my friends because I am deeply monolingual in what I can read and write. But in Indonesia, I've been told by my friends who like live there that, hey, like there's real person fiction that is just sometimes not even reskinned in terms of like changing the name of the people that they're about. So RPF, real person fiction, has a lot of overlap with self-insert or like ex-reader, which is basically where the reader imagines themselves to be in a romantic relationship with the object of their affection, the celebrity in question, and that the works can get like that, that the fandom relations gets filed off and then reskinned for publishing, and they can go on to be adapted into TV shows, which is so interesting to me. But also, I'm going to say this, I think that other countries, like their pace of adapting and like producing media is just a lot faster than the Hollywood model, just completely. So I'm just like kind of in like admiration of it, like, wow, your production cycle is really tight, but also I hope all the actors are like being taken care of and all that stuff. Anyways, that's unrelated, but I just hope that everyone on set is okay. But yes, that's just a broad overview. Very, very brief. Yeah.
Interesting. I guess then it means, but I think from that you can draw that you're getting a similar sort of influence, where there is some like readership interest, and also the thing is often I think when we talk about writers and readers, because we categorize it as writers and readers, it feels distinct. But writers are readers, and there are so many people who would identify as readers, and like you said, with C.S. Picard, who felt that they weren't a writer, even though they were actively writing fics at the time. And you have this overlap where it's basically like this one community that isn't actually separated, and what it's doing through that exploration of like whatever it's exploring is like deeply personal, but also deeply interconnected. And I think that's fascinating. How then that shapes it, because going back to our earlier thing of thinking like the chicken before the egg, like is the way that it was defined and visualized and becoming very like archival, because then influencing the way that was written. But like what you just said there, and based on that, as well as earlier, the archival was a necessity for an immediate situation, but what was being written, then as we re-explore it, becomes to fit that schema. But it means that it is also incredibly dynamic, which I think very nicely leads to, I guess, the sort of final section that I wanted to, think about is going from here and having an understanding of, broadly how fan fiction like has worked and how interest has caused it to develop, and how communities like form within it, both externally in their respective fandoms, but then those fandoms get brought in. But trying to think, as myself, as someone who's new to it, who is an emerging, writer, and is interested in engaging with these very, I think, like fruitful spaces, particularly where you have expansion beyond like the norm, which I think is very much what like fan fiction does. But I'm interested to hear what benefits you think there are, particularly for like reader writers, to engage in fan fiction if they haven't, or what do you get as a writer yourself, in that space?
Okay, just in terms of benefits, you get to, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier or not, but like fanfiction.net has over 61.5 billion words on its website as of like 2017. So the number's old. There's probably more at this point. And the little less than 7 million like works on it as of 2017. So the number's old. And what is like the number that I want to point out is 176 million like reviews. So like direct engagement with the story. Now, I'm not saying you're gonna get like 3,000 like comments on your first thing that you write, but serialized works, it's very like you're very likely to get engagement. If you're writing about something, about a character or a setting or a thing, especially if it's a popular fandom, you're more likely to get engagement, but I wouldn't go in expecting it. It's also like another benefit is just to like see how other people interpret canon and how their execution and their level of skill and what their enterprise of the fic is and how close they are to executing it the way that they want to. It's seeing how people can develop over time as well, because a lot of authors will have like 60, 200 or like 13 different works on their page, on like their profile, and you can see their growth over time, which I personally find is very like, oh, you weren't like just capable of writing like insanely like incredible, well-crafted stories from the get-go. You built up to it. That makes me feel better about myself. But also it gives a sense of like, this is growth over time. That's not like immediately replicable. It's also, you get access to a community of fellow writers and readers with a high to sum up, you get access to a community of fellow writers and readers with a higher possibility of actual engagement. And it's like almost safer because it's fic. It's not held to the same standard that you may have for yourself with original work, where you have to come up with everything wholesale original. Yes. Did I answer everything?
That's great. Yeah, and I think also in a different way that's also practical. I think if you're thinking as a reader, what you get is access to just like such a much broader array of work, just because of the way that like the publishing cycle works, and obviously the way that popular publishing works. people often criticize and comment and say a lot of the popular works all look the same, but that's just going to happen because, you know, you have authors writing into space. That is what is like popular. That's what's selling. That's what's moving on the shelves. So I don't, you know, there is room to critique that and how that comes about. But at the same time, that in the same way of like the fan fiction is indicative of what people are looking for and wanting to read. And I think then in the broader sense, what fan fiction is, you know, what I want people to realize is you just have access to that times, you know, 1,000, 100,000, right? You can go and sit and read someone else's work. Like, where can you say you've read 16 million words of like one author's work, with also the opportunity to actually engage with that person potentially, you know, in an extreme case. So the final thought then really is, where would you recommend people start? I shared a little bit of like how I started, but do you have thoughts?
I do. I have a lot of thoughts. One, don't take the path that I did. I went from, this was early 2010s, so why'd I do that Disney Channel? Okay, no, it's fine. I went from Wattpad to fanfiction.net to AO3. This kind of like spanned like the early 2010s, which I really, internet. But this was a better avenue than other sectors of the internet. I will say this about Wattpad. The algorithm makes it very difficult to find anything. The filtering system is atrocious. The majority of stuff on there is real person fiction, which if you're not comfortable with, I completely understand. There's a lot of it. There's just a lot of it. And the demographic does tend to skew lower, with 92% being like 13 to like a younger audience to like millennials, like Gen Z to millennials. That's their prime demographic. That's why it was acquired by Naver in 2021. Anyways, that's a whole other thing. Fanfiction.net, it has serviceable like tools in terms of like filtering stuff, but I wouldn't say it's overly robust. The summaries like make it very difficult for people to go into depth about anything. It is where trends live in, like come into being and then die on it. It is the progenitor of character bashing as a tag. I don't think it's a particularly helpful practice. But like I would say AO3, Archive of Our Own, is probably the best place in terms of being able to filter everything. You have so much control over like things that you do not want to see. It's fantastic. And also if you have an account, you can block and mute people. So you don't have to see their works as you scroll through. It's great. And you can bookmark stuff for later use. You have that functionality on the other platforms, but you can also make them private, which is an additional feature that I find like very useful. There's just a very active user base on AO3. And if you are going to post your stuff on there, the majority of the feedback you're going to get is positive. And it's like, unlike fanfiction.net, which is kind of overrun with bots in some sections of the website, you're not going to have that problem. Are some of its policies somewhat questionable? Yes. I'm specifying the anti-racism policies of AO3. But in comparison to Wattpad, where even if you do get a publishing deal, which don't take, it's a horrible publishing deal. It's awful. You get a lump sum fee that's not even like 10 grand. That's awful. And then you sell off all of like, anyways, don't take it is my point. Yeah, I would say AO3 is the biggest archive. I couldn't get stats for Wattpad because they're not very clear with their data, because they're primarily catering to corporate overseers who like corporations like who want like specific data, but like data that like suits them, because they're like, oh, we have like 90 million like monthly users, but how many like unique works are there? Like that sort of thing. That's what I'm more interested in terms of data, but they don't provide that. Anyways, yes.
All right, so AO3 is a great place to start, very customizable and seems to have good community. Well, that is, I think, really been fascinating for me, and even in preparing for this, I've now learned even more just in our discussion. So I want to thank those who are watching. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you've gotten from this as much as I believe myself and Lychee have, and that you've, of course, most importantly, enjoyed this session. But even beyond that, I personally hope that in approaching fan fiction as a reader, and approaching writing and what can be written about and how to explore what being a writer is, that you feel freshly inspired and particularly inspired to check out fan fiction and revisit things, look for things that you're interested in. And I think it gives you a renewed view of what you can explore in your own writing and what you can also explore in the texts you like to read. Did you have a final thing to say, Lychee, or?
No, not really. You just covered most everything, and you signed off in a really great way. I just want to say that there's so much that I would love to have dug into, but I genuinely hope that you got something from this, and that it's a place where I know that we've talked a lot about pathways to publishing and how E.L. James managed to sell X amount of units. But it's the fanfiction space is comprised of a bunch of people on the spectrum from never written a story before, this is the first time publishing anything, to seasoned professionals who are doing this just for fun. It's a hobbyist space, and I really hope that if you're afraid to show your work to people in your life, that this is a space where you feel like you can share it with other people without the fear of judgment. Because there are people out there who are into the same stuff as you are, even if it's just seeing people miserable. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.